Imagine this. You're drifting off to sleep in your childhood home, a house you know like the back of your hand. Every creak in the floorboards, every groan of the old pipes, it's all familiar. But tonight, something feels wrong. You hear the front door slowly creak open, even though you remember locking it. Your heart pounds, your body freezes, and in that moment, you realize someone is inside. That creeping fear, the kind that paralyzes you in your own home, is the same terror that entire families, small towns, and police officers across America have felt when faced with murders so dark, so bizarre, that decades later, they remain unsolved. And tonight, we're diving into those cases. But before we begin, if you find yourself captivated by stories that unravel mystery, fear, and chilling intrigue, make sure you subscribe and hit that notification bell. Because here, we don't just tell stories. We take you inside them. And trust me, you're not going to want to miss what's coming. The story begins. Our first unsolved murder takes us to East Chicago, Indiana, in the winter of 1945. The war had just ended, families were celebrating, and the entire country felt like it was finally breathing again. But for the Orlick family, that sense of peace was about to be shattered in the most horrifying way imaginable. The Orlicks lived in a modest, two-story home on a quiet street. Their neighbors described them as ordinary, church-going, polite, and private. The kind of family nobody paid too much attention to. Which is exactly why, when something happened to them, no one could understand how or why. It started on a Sunday morning when a neighbor noticed the Orlicks' front door wasn't just unlocked, it was wide open. That was strange enough, but what made it chilling was the sight inside. The entire family, mother, father, and 2 children, were found brutally murdered in their living room. But here's where it gets even stranger: nothing had been stolen. Valuables, cash, jewelry, all untouched. The only thing out of place was a single detail so eerie that even seasoned detectives couldn't shake it. On the living room wall, smeared in what looked like the family's own blood, was a message. 3 words. No one has ever publicly confirmed what it said. Some reports claim it read "Don't look." Others say it was simply "Smile." To this day, that detail alone keeps investigators awake at night. A town gripped by fear. News spread like wildfire. The Orlicks weren't known to have enemies. They weren't involved in crime. They weren't wealthy. Which left everyone asking the same question: why them? The police worked around the clock, interviewing neighbors, chasing leads, trying to piece together the last hours of the Orlick family's life. Witnesses claimed to have seen a man lingering outside the home late that night, smoking a cigarette under a street lamp. But when detectives pressed for details, every description seemed to conflict. One person said he wore a hat. Another said he was bald. One said he had a limp. Another swore he walked normally. The case went nowhere. And then, something terrifying happened. The copycat? 6 months later, across state lines in Ohio, another family was murdered. The crime scene? Nearly identical. A family of 4, killed in their living room, valuables untouched. And again, words written on the wall in blood. The message this time was chillingly direct. "I was here." Panic spread. Newspapers ran with headlines like "Murderer on the Move" and "The Family Slayer Strikes Again." Families started locking their doors at night, something many had never even bothered to do before. But just like in Indiana, police couldn't find the killer. No fingerprints, no DNA, no weapon. Just the words. And then, silence. For nearly 2 years. The sleep killer. That silence ended in 1948, in a small Pennsylvania town. A single mother and her 2 children were found murdered in their beds, as though they had simply gone to sleep and never woken up. This time, there were no words on the wall. But there was something else. On the kitchen table sat a plate of half-eaten food and a cup of coffee, still warm when police arrived. Whoever killed them had stayed in the house, had eaten in the kitchen, had made themselves comfortable. This detail horrified investigators. Not only had the killer been bold enough to murder a family in their own home, but he or she had lingered, savoring the moment, while their victims lay dead just rooms away. The press dubbed this figure the sleep killer. And then, like smoke in the wind, they vanished. An unsolved thread. Here's the part that chills me. These cases, the Orlicks in Indiana, the family in Ohio, the mother and children in Pennsylvania, were never officially connected. The police departments in each state dismissed the similarities as coincidence. But if you lay the files side by side, the patterns scream at you. Families. Living rooms. Valuables untouched. Messages left, or food eaten. And then, nothing. It's as if someone out there was killing, taunting, and then slipping back into the shadows. And worse, it's possible they never stopped. Because unsolved murders with these same bizarre hallmarks have appeared across the United States for decades. Now, this is only the beginning. In this series of stories, you're going to hear about murders so strange, so terrifying, that they'll keep you awake long after this video ends. In the next act, we're traveling to California, where a teenage girl vanished from her home in the middle of the night, leaving behind a single clue that police still can't explain. And trust me, this case doesn't just border on the paranormal, it kicks the door wide open. The vanishing room. Imagine you're a parent, tucking your daughter into bed. You close the door gently, whisper goodnight, and head down the hallway, comforted by the sound of her radio playing softly in the background. Hours later, you wake to silence. You walk to her room, and the bed is empty. No sound, no struggle, no sign she ever existed. That was the nightmare reality for the Martin family of Riverside, California, in the summer of 1974. The disappearance. 16-year-old Laura Martin was a bright, bubbly teenager who dreamed of becoming a nurse. She lived with her parents and younger brother in a single-story ranch house on the outskirts of town. On the night of July 11th, Laura had spent the evening writing in her diary and listening to her favorite records. Her mother checked on her around 10:30 p.m., kissed her goodnight, and went to bed. By morning, Laura was gone. Her bed looked as though it had never been slept in. The sheets were neatly tucked, the pillows fluffed. Her window was locked from the inside. And the front door? Still bolted shut. It was as if Laura had simply vanished. A single clue. Police scoured the house, and at first, there was nothing unusual. No forced entry, no footprints, no broken locks. But then, they noticed something strange. On Laura's nightstand sat her diary. On the final page, written in her neat handwriting, was a single line. "He's coming tonight." The Martins swore they had no idea what it meant. Laura had never mentioned a boyfriend, never hinted at being afraid of anyone. But detectives believed this line was the key. And here's where it gets even creepier. The phone calls. The night after Laura's disappearance, the Martins' phone rang at exactly midnight. Her father answered, and on the other end, a man whispered, "She's mine now." Click. The calls continued every night for a week. Always at midnight. Always a whisper. Never more than 3 words. The Martins begged police to trace the calls, but in 1974, technology wasn't fast enough. By the time the operator connected, the caller was gone. The last call came on the 7th night. This time, the voice said something different. "Check the river." The river search. Police immediately searched the Santa Ana River, which cut through Riverside just a few miles from the Martins' home. They dragged the water for days, pulling up debris, mud, even abandoned cars. But no trace of Laura. And then, almost as if the killer was mocking them, reports began surfacing of a girl matching Laura's description being spotted in towns miles away. Gas stations, diners, rest stops. Witnesses swore they saw her, pale and quiet, accompanied by an older man who never let her speak. But every time police followed up, the trail went cold. The diary mystery. As investigators dug deeper, they learned something chilling about Laura's diary. The handwriting on that final line, "He's coming tonight," was slightly off. Almost as if it had been forged. A handwriting expert later testified that while it looked similar to Laura's, subtle differences suggested it was written by someone else. Which raises the terrifying possibility, whoever took Laura was inside her room before she disappeared. A stranger in town. Detectives began questioning neighbors, and one detail stood out. Multiple people reported seeing a strange man loitering near the Martins' home in the weeks before the disappearance. He was described as tall, thin, with greasy black hair, and he always wore the same thing, a long brown trench coat, even in the heat of summer. But no one knew his name. And just days after Laura vanished, he disappeared too. Some believe this was the abductor. Others argue it was coincidence. But in unsolved cases like this, coincidence often feels like fate. The unanswered questions. Over the years, new tips trickled in. A former classmate claimed Laura had mentioned a man who watched her from the street. A gas station attendant swore he saw her get into a dark sedan the night she vanished. And yet, no body, no confirmed sightings, no resolution. The most unsettling theory? Some believe Laura was taken by someone she knew. A teacher. A neighbor. Maybe even a family friend. Someone who could have slipped inside without a struggle. Someone who knew exactly when to come. In that diary entry? Not a warning, but a taunt. The Martin family never saw Laura again. Her room remains untouched, frozen in time. A diary that ends with a single cryptic message, and a phone call that haunts investigators to this day. But this wasn't the only case where someone disappeared without a trace, leaving behind only clues that seemed more like riddles than answers. Because in our next, we head to Alaska, where an entire group of people vanished in one night, and the evidence left behind makes this one of the strangest unsolved murders in American history. The Alaska disappearance. Picture this. It's the middle of winter in Alaska. Snow falls in thick sheets, muffling every sound. You're driving down a lonely highway, headlights barely cutting through the blizzard. You see a diner up ahead, its neon sign flickering like a heartbeat in the storm. You pull in for warmth, expecting to see people inside. But when you walk through the door, the place is silent. Coffee cups sit steaming on the counter, jukebox still playing, burgers half-eaten on plates. And every single person, gone. That's not fiction. That's exactly what investigators found one night in 1959, when an entire group of people seemed to vanish from a roadside lodge, never to be seen again. The lodge at Cooper Pass. The story begins at Cooper Pass Lodge, a popular rest stop for truckers and travelers along the Seward Highway. On February 14th, Valentine's Day, the lodge was bustling with life, locals grabbing dinner, couples celebrating, and a group of 4 men traveling from Anchorage to Seward. By midnight, the snowstorm had become so brutal that nobody could leave. Witnesses later said the atmosphere inside was warm and cheerful, fire crackling, jukebox spinning, and the smell of coffee filling the air. But what happened next remains one of the greatest mysteries in Alaskan history. The discovery. The next morning, a passing trucker stopped by. He stepped into the lodge expecting laughter and warmth, but instead found a scene frozen in time. Plates of food sat half-eaten on tables. Glasses of beer were still cold. A radio was playing softly in the corner. But every single person, patrons, staff, even the owner, was gone. No footprints in the snow leading away. No tire tracks. No signs of struggle. Just absence. The missing 4. Among the missing were 4 men traveling together. George Holt, 29. Ray Carter, 32. Sam Delaney, 31. Tom Briggs, 28. They had been seen laughing at the bar just hours before. Their coats still hung on the rack by the door. Their wallets, keys, and even cigarettes were left on the table. It was as if they had simply stood up and walked into thin air. Theories. Investigators swarmed the lodge. They found no signs of forced entry, no blood, no overturned furniture. But they did find something that chilled them. In the back storage room, on the concrete floor, was a single word scratched into the dust with someone's finger. Run. Who wrote it? Why? Nobody knows. Some theorize the group fled into the storm, but if they had, there would have been footprints. Others suggested an avalanche, but the area around the lodge was untouched. A few locals whispered darker theories, that something inhuman had come for them. The legend grows. Weeks later, hunters deep in the woods claimed they stumbled upon an abandoned campsite. Inside was a torn piece of cloth and a boot believed to belong to one of the missing men. But there were no bodies. No bones. No trace beyond that. The case grew into legend. Truckers refused to stop at the lodge. Locals called it cursed. Some swore they could still hear laughter and music drifting from the empty building late at night, as though time inside had never moved forward. The unsolved thread. Here's the part that keeps people up at night. Decades later, in the 1980s, another group vanished under eerily similar circumstances at a remote Alaskan roadhouse. Same pattern, food left on tables, belongings untouched, and a single cryptic message scrawled on the wall. This time, it read, "Stay quiet." Coincidence? Or the work of something far more sinister than we can explain? To this day, no one knows what happened to the men of Cooper Pass Lodge, or the others who disappeared like them. Were they victims of a hidden serial predator? Or is there something about Alaska's remote wilderness that swallows people whole? What we do know is this: the cases remain unsolved, and the evidence suggests that someone, or something, was sending a message. And before we continue to the next case, let me remind you, if stories like this fascinate you, if you find yourself drawn into the shadows of these mysteries, make sure you subscribe, leave a comment sharing which case unsettled you most so far, and hit the like button. That support allows us to keep digging into the darkest corners of America's unsolved murders. Because next, we're heading to the Deep South, where a small-town murder was solved once, only for the truth to unravel decades later, leaving everyone questioning if the real killer has been walking free all along. The trial that lied. Imagine being told your loved one's killer has been caught, tried, and convicted. Relief floods through you, you can finally sleep at night. But then, years later, cracks in the story begin to show. Evidence doesn't line up. Witnesses recant. And suddenly, you're forced to face a horrifying question: what if the wrong person was convicted, and the real killer is still out there? That's exactly what happened in the tiny town of Carrollton, Mississippi, in 1962. The murder of Sarah Mitchell. Sarah Mitchell was a beloved local schoolteacher. At 27 years old, she was vibrant, outspoken, and deeply loved by her students. One evening in April, she left the schoolhouse just after 7 p.m., walked the short distance home, and was never seen alive again. The next morning, her neighbor found her lying face down in her front yard. She had been strangled. Her purse was tossed nearby, but nothing was missing. Whoever did this didn't want her money. They wanted her silenced. A quick conviction. The town erupted in fear and outrage. Detectives quickly zeroed in on a suspect, James "Jimmy" Lawson, a 24-year-old farmhand with a minor criminal record. He had once done odd jobs for Sarah's family and was rumored to have had an argument with her months earlier. Within weeks, Jimmy was arrested. At trial, prosecutors painted him as a bitter young man who lashed out when Sarah rejected his advances. A single witness claimed they saw him walking near her home that night. That was enough. He was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. Case closed. Or so everyone thought. The cracks appear. For nearly a decade, the town moved on. But in 1971, Jimmy's defense attorney received a letter from a man on his deathbed in Memphis. The man confessed that he had been hired to lie on the stand. He admitted the prosecution had pressured him into identifying Jimmy near the scene, even though he hadn't been there. And that wasn't all. New forensic testing on Sarah's clothing revealed DNA that did not match Jimmy. In fact, it didn't match anyone in the town. The shadowy stranger. Locals began whispering about another man who had been seen around Carrollton in the weeks before Sarah's death. He was described as well-dressed, with piercing blue eyes, and he drove a black Cadillac, a car that stood out in a rural Mississippi town. Several witnesses recalled seeing this man speaking with Sarah after school, though no one knew his name. When investigators attempted to track him down years later, he had vanished. Some even claimed he wasn't from Carrollton at all, that he was passing through on business, or something darker. The mystery deepens. By the late 1970s, Jimmy Lawson was released due to lack of evidence. But that left one haunting truth: Sarah's real killer had never been found. Some theorized it was a crime of passion. Others believed Sarah may have stumbled onto something she wasn't supposed to know, perhaps corruption in town politics or affairs of powerful men. In small towns, secrets run deep. But without a name, without solid evidence, the case collapsed into silence. The unsettling detail. Here's the part that makes this story unforgettable. When Sarah's diary was finally released to her family years later, they found a cryptic entry written just days before her death. It read, "The man with blue eyes came again. He says I shouldn't tell anyone." She never explained who he was, or what secret she was keeping. But the timing, the description, and the chilling warning point to someone other than Jimmy Lawson. Someone who may have slipped away forever. To this day, Sarah Mitchell's murder remains unsolved. The town still remembers her, but the identity of the man with the blue eyes lingers like a ghost. Was he just a drifter passing through, or a predator who used Carrollton as his hunting ground? And worse, if he wasn't caught then, could he have struck again somewhere else? Because in our next story, we head to New York, where a series of bizarre murders left detectives chasing a phantom killer who seemed to know every move they made, sometimes before they even made it. The Phantom of New York. Imagine being a detective working a murder case. You're exhausted, chasing leads that keep going cold. And then, one morning, you arrive at the precinct and find an envelope on your desk. Inside is a letter describing details about the case, details that only the killer should know. That's exactly what detectives in Queens, New York, faced during one of the strangest and most chilling unsolved murder investigations in the 1970s. The first victim. In 1973, 22-year-old Deborah Klein was found strangled in her apartment. The scene was bizarre, nothing stolen, no forced entry. On her kitchen table was a single Polaroid photograph of Deborah herself, alive, sitting on her couch. Police realized it had been taken inside her apartment, by someone else. The letters. A week later, the lead detective received the letter in the mail. It was typed, addressed directly to him, and signed simply, "Yours, the Watcher." The letter described the crime scene in detail, including the color of Deborah's bedsheets and the exact time her radio had been left playing. None of these details had ever been released to the public. The writer also taunted police, saying, "You looked right at me when you canvassed the street. You'll never catch me." A pattern emerges. Months later, another woman was murdered. Same style, strangulation, no forced entry, and again, a Polaroid left behind. This time, the victim was photographed walking home just hours before her death, as though the killer had been stalking her, documenting her every move. Another letter arrived at the precinct days later, mocking detectives for being too slow to keep up. The man in the crowd. One officer swore he saw a man watching the crime scene from across the street during one of the investigations. He described him as tall, wearing a long overcoat, with a camera strap slung around his neck. When the officer moved to approach, the man melted into the crowd and vanished. Was this the Watcher himself? Or just another New Yorker drawn to the chaos? No one ever found out. The strange phone calls. As the murders continued, detectives started receiving phone calls at the station. A distorted voice would whisper, "Another one soon," before hanging up. The most chilling call came late one night when the killer said, "Check the trash on 82nd Street." Police rushed there and found a crumpled Polaroid of a woman walking home. Written on the back were the words, "She's next." Days later, that same woman was murdered. The case grows cold. Despite the killer's taunts, detectives could never catch him. They tried tracing the letters, analyzing the typewriter ink, even dusting the Polaroids for prints, but nothing. The watcher always seemed to be one step ahead. And then, as suddenly as he appeared, he stopped. No more murders. No more letters. No more Polaroids. Theories. Some believe the watcher was a local photographer who became obsessed with his subjects. Others think he was a police officer himself, which would explain how he knew so much about the investigations. But perhaps the most terrifying theory? That he simply got bored and moved on to another city. To this day, the identity of the watcher remains a mystery. The Polaroids, the letters, the phone calls, they paint the picture of a killer who didn't just want to take lives, he wanted to play a game. And the most disturbing part? There are dozens of cold cases in New York from that same time period that match his pattern, cases that may all be connected, but never officially linked. Which brings us to our next story. Because while the watcher haunted New York, down in Texas, a series of murders would unfold that were so brutal, so bizarre, that locals still whisper about them as if speaking too loudly might bring the killer back. The killing field. Imagine driving down a lonely stretch of highway at night. The air is heavy, your headlights illuminate only a thin ribbon of road ahead, and then, off in the darkness, you see it. A handmade wooden cross stuck into the ground. Then another. Then another. Dozens of them, lining the fields like silent sentinels. Each one marking a life stolen. That haunting stretch of land exists, and it's one of the darkest mysteries in Texas history. The fields outside Houston. Just outside League City, Texas, lies a 25-acre patch of abandoned land now infamous as the Texas Killing Field. For decades, it's been the site of countless disappearances and murders. Between the 1970s and 1990s, more than 30 young women vanished in the area. Many were later found dumped in the fields. Others were never found at all. But the strangest part? No single killer was ever identified. The first bodies. The nightmare began in 1971, when a 13-year-old girl named Colette Wilson disappeared after band practice. Weeks later, her body was found in a nearby drainage ditch. Not long after, another girl went missing, then another, and another. By the mid-1970s, locals began to whisper about the fields as cursed. Parents warned their daughters never to walk alone. Truckers refused to stop in the area after dark. And still, the bodies kept appearing. A chilling pattern. Investigators noticed a terrifying detail. Almost every victim was young, female, and last seen walking along a road near Interstate 45. They were abducted in broad daylight, often just yards from their homes. But when police searched the fields, they always found the same thing: shallow graves, minimal evidence, and an eerie sense that the killer, or killers, knew the land intimately. Too many suspects. Over the years, police considered dozens of suspects. Serial killers like Henry Lee Lucas and Edward Bell were both linked to the area. Bell even confessed to killing several girls in the 1970s, but his statements never fully matched the evidence. Other investigators believe multiple killers were using the fields, almost as if the land itself had become a dumping ground. Some even argue that the murders became copycat crimes, feeding into a chilling cycle of violence. The Four Friends. One of the most haunting cases was that of Laura Miller, a 16-year-old girl who disappeared in 1984. She had walked to a nearby convenience store to use the payphone and never came back. 2 years later, her body was discovered in the killing field, just yards away from where another young woman had been found earlier. Laura's case drew national attention because her father, Tim Miller, refused to stop searching for her killer. He later founded Texas EquiSearch, a search and rescue organization that has helped solve hundreds of missing person cases worldwide. But to this day, Laura's killer has never been caught. The unsettling theory. Here's the detail that chills investigators the most. Satellite imagery taken in the late 1980s revealed faint dirt paths running through the fields, paths not visible from the highway. Some believe these trails were created by the killers themselves, a hidden map through the tall grass where they could move unseen, bringing their victims to their final resting place. In other words, the fields weren't just a dumping ground. They were a hunting ground. To this day, the Texas Killing Field remains one of America's most haunting unsolved murder sites. Locals still avoid it. Families still mourn unanswered questions. And every cross planted in that soil tells a story that never found its ending. And while Texas was gripped by fear, across the country in Massachusetts, another case was unfolding, one so strange that even seasoned detectives questioned whether they were dealing with a human killer, or something far more sinister. The Lady of the Dunes. Imagine standing on a quiet beach at dawn. The tide is low, gulls cry overhead, and the sand is cool beneath your feet. But then, you see something. Half buried in the dunes. At first, you think it's driftwood. Maybe a log washed ashore. But when you step closer, your stomach drops. It isn't driftwood. It's a body. And for nearly 50 years, no one could say who she was, or who had killed her. A discovery in the sand. On July 26, 1974, a young girl walking her dog near Race Point Beach in Provincetown, Massachusetts, stumbled across the badly decomposed body of a woman. She was lying face down, her head resting on a folded pair of jeans, as if someone had staged her like a grotesque portrait. Her hands had been removed. Her head was nearly severed. Yet someone had placed a blanket partially over her, almost as if they couldn't decide whether to conceal her or honor her. The press would call her the Lady of the Dunes. A mystery with no name. For decades, investigators struggled with two questions. Who is she? And who killed her? Without hands, they couldn't get fingerprints. Without dental records, they couldn't make a match. Artists created sketches. Newspapers printed descriptions. But no one came forward. She had simply appeared. As if the dunes themselves had birthed her. The theories. The case spawned endless speculation. Some believed she was a runaway. Others thought she was the victim of organized crime. Her injuries suggested rage, but also precision, like someone experienced with knives. One theory suggested she was killed by the mobster Whitey Bulger, who was active in the area during the 1970s. Another theory connected her to a local fisherman. But then came the strangest theory of all. The Jaws connection. In 2015, author Joe Hill, the son of Stephen King, proposed something wild. While watching the movie Jaws, filmed in Massachusetts in 1974, he noticed a woman in the background wearing blue jeans and a bandana. She looked eerily similar to the Lady of the Dunes sketches. Was it possible she was an extra in the film, captured forever on camera just weeks before her death? The idea went viral, but like every other lead, it faded into uncertainty. A breakthrough. In 2022, nearly 50 years later, forensic genealogy finally gave her a name, Ruth Marie Terry, a 37-year-old woman from Tennessee. She had been newly married before vanishing that summer. But while her identity was revealed, her killer was not. To this day, no one has been charged. Her story remains open, a reminder of how even answers can feel incomplete. The weight of unsolved. Think about that. For nearly half a century, Ruth's body lay in the cold sand while families across America wondered if she was their missing loved one. Detectives chased shadows, journalists wrote theories, and entire generations passed without closure. Her story isn't just hers, it's every family's worst nightmare. To lose someone, and never know why. And that, right there, is the haunting truth about these unsolved murders. Behind every headline, every crime scene photo, and every whispered legend is a family still waiting for answers that may never come. But we keep telling their stories. Because as long as we do, these victims are not forgotten. Their cases remain alive. So if this story left you shaken, intrigued, or even just curious, don't let it end here. Subscribe right now and join me as we uncover more mysteries, more darkness, and more truths hidden in the shadows. Because these stories don't sleep, and neither should you.